first question for Fra to basically discuss the overall situation of the tariffs as well as the geopolitics and the basic impact that we expect on GDP growth. So, but I think more specifically within that overall framework, maybe Fra, but perhaps you could enlighten us on what you think of what has happened with regards to the overall level of tariffs, and at what level of tariffs do you think is a stress scenario? And after that, I'll follow up with you on your geopolitical expectations and how it will affect GDP growth.
Thank you, Ray. Very good afternoon to everyone. Thank you, Mark, for inviting me to this panel. I'm here with a very highly knowledgeable panel, so I have to be careful with what I say. I'm going to zoom straight into the point about stress level. And I'm going to address that in three parts. Yeah? Short term, long term, and then I'll talk a little bit about Malaysia. For the short term answer, of course, it will vary from country to country. Why do I say that? Because it depends on your products, your trade partners, your key export destinations, for example. So if you compare Malaysia, the tariffs that US will impose on us, that will affect 13% of our exports. That's how much we export to US. But say compared to Indonesia at 8%, or Korea at 18%, or Vietnam at almost 20%. So that direct impact varies from one country to another. Likewise, in terms of products, what we export to US, 60% are electronics, about 30%, 20 to 30% are semiconductors. These are products that are highly demanded by the American markets. So I think that's why they are exempted, because they are in high demand. So the impact would depend from the external sector on your exposure to these respective markets. And then, of course, there's domestic demand, like you mentioned. And domestic demand, how much it contributes to each domestic economy, again, differs. Still, so in the end, when you evaluate the impact, you have to consider both the direct impact with the country, with your exports with other countries, depending on how open your economy is, and finally the extent of domestic demand. So for us, as you mentioned, the impact is pretty much unmanageable. However, if you look at the entire global economy, estimate the impact is not trivial. We are talking about a cake that is a little bit smaller because of the actions by the Americans. And based on the IMF, OECD, and World Bank study, you can see to the extent that the tariffs are around 0 to 5%, it will be pretty small and mild. About 10%, it will begin to measurably reduce global trade. 15 to 20, that's roughly around the stress threshold for many countries, and above 25%, that would amount to severe disruption. However, having said that, we have seen time and again, we live in a highly intricately connected global economy. And somehow, despite some of these shocks, we have seen in the past how trade somehow finds a way. We've seen that since the Fukushima disaster, the Thai floods, even COVID, the Suez Canal closure, chip shortage. Yes, there'll be the initial shock, but after some time, trade will find a way. Even now, when China was subjected to 145% of tariffs, we would that is like almost an embargo level of trade restrictions. And yet, the demand for container cargo fell down by only about 40 to 50%. So there's still 50% amount of trade that's ongoing. So let me shift gradually to the long-term part. By what they've done, US has really reaped havoc in terms of the global trade architecture. There will be changes. There will be new trade patterns. OECD has estimated that at certain levels it's going to be very bad to some countries. So there will be adjustments. Immediately when we talk about trade shifts, already you are seeing, for example, replacement. which is how trade is substituted from one product to another, rerouting, circumvention, which is what in Trump 1.0 China did to via Vietnam, redirection, where you find new markets to some extent, which is what countries like us are trying to do with, say, for example, GCC, and then of course relocation, setting up a new production chain entirely. So there will be adjustments after 2 to 3 years. So where is Malaysia in all this? In the immediate term, we are pretty okay in much because of our product infrastructure, product structure, and then also there's in the short term there's a lot of front-loading activity, which is why our exports are pretty high at this moment in time. So, but going forward, given all the shocks, we really need to find a new way to reinvigorate new market, and that can only come if we come up with plans towards, for example, greater regional integration with ASEAN. And a lot of that means that we have to really bring forward many of the reforms that we talked about in terms of our product chain, in terms of our product diversification, and things like that. So let me end with just one thing. In the short term, it may be okay. In the long term, the core message is there will be plenty of adjustments, and adjustments are not always easy. Not everybody can do it and do it well. My final point here is we've spoken a lot about 25%. However, as Tengku Zafrul mentioned yesterday, the negotiation is still ongoing. That's Trump's way of really putting notice that, hey, you better make a deal with me quick. But I doubt that it'll be at that level going forward. I'll pause here. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Fra, for that very comprehensive discussion. And I think that's actually a very good segue to discuss supply chains. I mean, as you alluded to the fact that, again, it really depends on which sectors are affected, which kinds of specific goods, and all of that may be very differential, very messy, a little bit like the spaghetti bowl kind of illusion that some economists have described the current situation as. So that would be a good segue to the next question for Kian Ming. And I think global supply chains today are, of course, very, very complex. Like I say, it's a little bit like that spaghetti bowl, which I mentioned. So do you think ramping up tariffs in this manner can realistically bring manufacturing back to the US? And does it really make any sense to try to sideline the trade surplus countries in this manner?
I think most economists would answer that question by saying no. I don't think those tactics are going to bring back manufacturing to the US in a big way. But if you look at the way President Trump negotiates trade deals and wants to go out to seek quick wins, not just on the trade front, but also on things like trying to seek peace deals in the Middle East and also in Ukraine, it is basically about capturing headlines with, I would say, whatever he can get from maybe a more superficial front. And I think that is something that we need to take note of with regards to our trade negotiations with the US, because that is what Vietnam has done, right? To say that I'm going to promise you a quick win that you can put on the table by saying I'm going to zeroize all import tariffs from the US to Vietnam, and make some sort of a vague promise of trying to stop transshipments or limit transshipments from Vietnam to US by accepting a much higher tariff rate, although it is not clear how that is going to be enforced. So that is basically Trump's short to medium term negotiating strategy. And I don't think it would be that helpful to his ends. But what I think we should take note of is the fact that there will be real concrete changes in the supply chain, whereby more and more countries would be looking at instead of a China plus one strategy, a US minus strategy. Doesn't mean that we can ignore the US. It's still the most important export market for Malaysia, even though China is our largest trading partner. But having supply chains where we look towards ASEAN, integrate much more within ASEAN and the Asia Pacific, and perhaps ASEAN looking towards Europe as well. And this may also include, US companies coming here as well to set up, maybe at a smaller basis, but we definitely can see Chinese companies coming to ASEAN in a much more aggressive manner to take advantage of this kind of US minus approach. So, the US is in a way shooting itself in the foot by forcing countries in Southeast Asia to choose.
Thank you, Kian Ming. So I guess based on that discussion, it almost appears that the reasons are largely politically motivated, and in that, Trump hopes to reap some political capital. And I think on that note, I'd like to turn to Bridget. And of course, I mean, apart from the fact that as our two other esteemed panelists have mentioned, I mean, we're not really going to see an effectiveness of being able to boost the US a trade position very materially. So in that strategy, it seems that Trump firmly believes that there will be at least some domestic wins on the political front. But at the same time, doesn't that kind of present himself very negatively on the international relations stage? And wouldn't that also risk alienating him against the other regional trading blocs?
Thank you very much, Ray, and to Mark for inviting me. And of course, a lot of what is going on is politics, but of course, it is also impacting the economy. I think in answering your question, and I want to make just a few comments. First of all, I think what we're seeing is a group of ideologues who have a very different type of vision about how to manage the economy. And the tariffs are just the beginning. They're not the end. We have a system of changing supply chains, changing the financial system. And of course, there will be impacts that come from de-dollarization, and there will be counter reactions. So we are really at a very important cusp in the changing geoeconomics from the political mindset of the Trump administration, the MAGA. For those who don't like them, they call them the maggots. So they have the two different. But you have to also appreciate that what is driving this is a type of politics of social media, of trying to stay in the news, the kind of nationalist rhetoric, and a particular type of vested interests that are taking opportunity of these economic distractions to make money. It's important to realize how much Trump and his family has made in a very short period of time. And these are distracting dynamics that are taking place. But for countries like Malaysia and ASEAN, it is important to begin from the perspective of recognizing the broader and deeper dynamics that are happening to the global political economy. And also to recognize that you need a multifaceted strategy to engage it. Second kind of observation is that you have to ask yourself the question, is this something short-term or is this something long-term? And the answer is it's both. There are short-term particular measures that you have to deal with tariffs in terms of negotiations, dealing with bullies, and recognizing the tariffs will have an important issues of transshipment that will be brought into the conversations. And we will have dynamics that involve the US elections. One of the reasons why they're doing a lot of things front-loading is that this expectation is that the elections in 26 will have a negative impact on the Republicans and the Trump administration. But we will see how much of that it will be. And of course, we've seen a lot of power grabs by the Trump administration and a destruction of the capacity of government to be able to address issues. the appointment of the nominee for the US ambassador to Malaysia is an example of a weakening of capacity to be able to address these sets of issues. But then the longer term question is the issues, these changes and drivers of what's going on are not short term. This started in the first administration of Trump. It extended under COVID, and it's going to continue. And in fact, the Biden administration didn't change much in terms of the fundamentals. It just changed the implementation strategies and its engagement. So thinking the long game, recognizing the long game is a very important thing from a policy perspective. So to answer to what to do in the circumstances, you need short-term strategies and you need long-term strategies. And here I have a similar kind of remarks to some things that you spoke just now. Short-term, you need to deal with a bully. And the bully, you don't provoke a bully when they come to visit, but you need to find a way to deal with bullies. That is, and I will say from everything that I understand, that the negotiations so far have gone reasonably well. The 25% is part of a bully tactic, and it shouldn't be over-interpreted. It should be, the negotiations are going to have more positive elements. But you need to also have more effective strategies short-term. That means I disagree that you need ASEAN. And the reason is there are many players in ASEAN that are not helpful. The Myanmars, the Cambodias, they're now scam economies. They're not helpful for you. You have to choose your partners in ASEAN. Indonesia, Singapore. Right? You have to have a strategy to stay ahead of the competition. And your competition is also ASEAN players. Because in the tariff game, you need this particular element. And you need to have a bit more caution in who you engage and how you engage. With BRICS, with Iran, with China. These things can provoke a bully in a particular way, especially someone that is so unstable. But the long-term strategies, decoupling, diversification, developing the local economy. This is the most important differential that I wanted to make with you in the conversation, is that you need to restructure Malaysia's economy to move away from some of these dependents in the long term. The negotiations are protecting the exports. They're not protecting the local SMEs and others in the economy. And this is something that needs greater attention. I think I've reached my time.
Thank you for that discussion, Bridget. So I guess we all agree on the same point that we need to restructure, reevaluate, and recalibrate our supply chains going forward. So that there is a way out of all of this. And I think, like what you mentioned, it is a long-term game. I mean, we are looking through 5-year presidential cycles, and who knows, you know, what will happen in 10 years. It might not be him again. Okay, well, okay, so I think this presents hope, and I think on the topic of hope, we can see that despite all of these trade noises, the ringgit has actually done pretty well, as I presented. So who better to answer this than Fra from Bank Negara? We do note that we've seen a lot of stability in the ringgit. Thank you, Bank Negara. And I think secondly, we can also note that at the same time, we're seeing this sedimentation of external risks. I mean, first it was the tariffs, and increasingly we're seeing a very unstable geopolitical situation in the Middle East. So do you see these external risks intensifying, or do you think there are other kind of emergent external risk concerns that we need to be worried about, and whether you agree with my earlier sanguine assessment of the ringgit and the bond market?
Been predominantly influenced by external factors more than domestic factors. Of course, there are from time to time, domestic factors would crop up, affect sentiment, cause some inflows or outflows or inflows, mostly outflows if it's negative news, of course. But by and large, we're a small open economy. our forex market is not as deep as, say, the developed economies. So developments in many parts of the world, including interest differentials, tend to have an impact on the ringgit. We have seen post-COVID, for example, the fact that we didn't have inflation issue cost other countries, whereas there were in other countries, caused the interest rate differential to really widen. And ringgit was held post-COVID up until 2024, I would think, before turnaround. So as it is, to us, markets will determine the ringgit. Our hand comes in order to attenuate that volatility in the ringgit, because that would help, folks like you and me, the financial markets to pretty much trade in an orderly manner. Having said that, when you look at the ringgit, our management of the ringgit, there are a few policy principles. Number one, we have a long-standing policy of the decentralization of the reserves. What do I mean by that is that businesses, by and large, keep their own forex and manage their own forex, rather than it being centralized at the central bank. Now, that means if you compare our reserves level, it is lower than other parts in the world, notably our neighbors. But it also means that the management of the exchange rate exposure is done by the respective agents in the economy. So even though we spoke about the ringgit being deeply depreciated, it was also a year when the economy did pretty well, despite that external shock. You had Federal Reserves racing through the markets, very strong dollar, ringgit really came down very hard, and yet the economy pretty much can take that punch and dealt with it. So there will be other shocks coming our way. I mean, I'm certain with somebody like Trump in the office, there will be many more of this to come. So the immediate measure now is really to make sure that there's greater depth in the market, so that there is less discrete jumps in the currency, which is where we come and we partner with GLICs, with GLCs, with major exporters and importers, such that they help us to manage the ringgit in terms of timing their inflows and their outflows, so that the gyration in the ringgit is less pronounced by raising liquidity in the market. That has helped. And certainly, and I'll sign off with this, is that ultimately, when you talk about currency, the only enduring support to the currency is the performance of the economy. To the extent that we continue to have an economy that does well, it will invite greater demand for the ringgit. That there is no shortcut to that, right? To the extent that we do our reforms, we have good growth themes happening in the economy, then there'll be interest in the currency, and it'll be in a much better position than where it is now. I'll pause here.
Thank you, Fra. So completely agree with you. We need to grow. We need to maintain our trade surplus and our current account balance. So I think on that note, I'd like to turn to Kian Ming. Since we were talking about trade and things like that, what do you think we should do to strengthen our position in future trade negotiations, or what could we have done to basically lead to better outcomes on tariffs? That's the first one. And I think secondly, do you think retaliation is a potential option, whether it has to be by Malaysia itself or whether with the ASEAN as an economic caucus? Is there anything we can do to secure a better outcome and secure perhaps our trade surplus in the long term?
Yeah, I'll talk about the tariff negotiations first, and then after that, I'll talk about the FTAs and also the trade position. If let's say you talk about it from a game theory perspective, Malaysia had three options with regards to negotiating with the US. I call them the three Cs. The first C would be to counter, basically retaliate. And if you look at the record of those countries that have tried to retaliate against the US, the big countries have had some level of success. And of course, we saw that primarily with China. But Malaysia is not in a position to do so. Even with the combined strength of ASEAN, I think ASEAN as a whole, there's a lot of coordination problems, in terms of being on the same page. And that's why I'm glad that we actually took that option off the table almost immediately. If there's one thing that ASEAN could do, that was it, right? The other coordination attempts, I think, like what Bridget says, for different reasons, is going to be very difficult. The second option is to continue, the second C. Continue meaning to basically continue the engagement with the US from a negotiation standpoint, taking perhaps quite a traditional route in terms of trying to address the non-tariff measures and maybe putting other things on the table that was not appropriate to be announced. But I think by and large, MITI would have taken that approach. And then the third approach would be to capitulate or to cave in, meaning to take the Vietnam approach to say that, yes, I'm going to allow all of the US imports to be zero rated. My sense is that MITI is taking the second approach, the continual approach. And if you look at the larger scheme of things, it's probably the best course of action to take at this point in time. Why do I say that? Right now, we're at 25%. In, let's say, the best case scenario, we can reduce it down to between 15 to 20%. I don't think it would make that much of a material difference. I don't think it would impact the trade surplus that we have now with the US in a big way. It's probably still in the ballpark in terms of keeping us relatively competitive, right? We're not going to be able to go down to 10%. I don't think so. Definitely not in the current situation. What we should continue to hope for, and this is probably beyond our negotiating strategy, is to have semiconductors continue to be exempt, right? So there's no indication that semiconductors are going to be part and parcel of that 25%. We hope that that situation will continue so that we can have that continued strategy of engagement. And who knows, all of you have heard of the taco strategy that Trump employs. There may be some postponements again later on if, let's say, things don't work out that way, and trade negotiations are actually quite difficult to do, as the Trump administration is finding out. So that's on the tariff side. I think the continue strategy will likely continue with hopefully limited downside for Malaysia. On the FTA side, I think this is one area where we could have done more. For example, we could have ratified the CPTPP, exploring other FTAs, including with Mercosur, for example. And this is part and parcel of how we want to signal to the markets that we are looking for alternative trading partners or additional trading partners.
Yeah, thank you, Kian. So essentially, FTAs and continuing to negotiate is important. And I think I'd like to perhaps cast a geopolitical angle on that, and perhaps Bridget, you could help enlighten us on your thoughts. Given that FTAs by their very nature, they tend to have light of being largely neutral. But I think at the same time, there has been some perceived shifts with Malaysia's geopolitical stance. For example, the announcement of being a partner with BRICS. So given such announcements, do you think there has been a shift in Malaysia's earlier stance of neutrality in terms of the geopolitical situation? And do you see it, and do you see such shifts as being detrimental to its ability to negotiate some of these FTA agreements?
Always tough questions from Ray. Let me begin by making sort of following a little bit up on Kian Ming's remarks. I think it's important to understand that these tariff negotiations are part of a Trump administration's policy tool for other things besides tariffs and for other things besides the issues of the economy. So be it the policy in the Middle East, be it on issues of Iran, be it on issues of China, these are issues that are coming out of different parts of the Trump administration. The second point to understand, and this is from all the feedback I receive from my people in Washington, is that the Trump administration is made up of different sets of actors who are advocating for different types of things. The MAGA movement is not a cohesive movement. And in fact, there is a capacity problem. And there are different administrations, things that come out of Treasury, things that come out of Customs, things that come out of different departments. And what has shocked most of the negotiating teams from Asia is how unprepared the Trump administration is to negotiate. The reasons is that they just don't necessarily know what they want. And then it comes a little bit on the fly of the pants in the conversation. And then other things come into the equation, these geopolitical issues. And in this regard, I think it is, and let me be blunt, the US-Malaysia relationship is not as good as people act like it is. It is important to understand that no prime minister in the last 3 prime ministers has met with a US president, the Biden administration or the Trump president in quite some time. And while the working relationship in areas of security and areas of the economy are still quite solid and I think very positive, I think the political aspects are less conducive and less cordial. And I think that there has been the perception in Washington that that Malaysia has become very close to China. And there are parts of the MAGA movement who see this in a very different way. Not all of the MAGA movement in this context. So I'm of one of those views as a political scientist that there is no such thing as neutrality. And the more you think and believe that you are neutral, the more you are not neutral in this context. And so issues such as the visit to Russia, the visit to China, the China visit, the I'm a friend of Iran, not necessary. You don't need to say you're the friend. Relations on Hamas, the movements on BRICS, these have alienated parts of the MAGA movement. Now, this is not my personal opinion that these strategies are not necessarily important ones, and we can take that debate in a different way. But one has to recognize that they've had political consequences. And quietly, speeches do include provocative remarks that are circulated. And so these things, and of course, remember, politicians, be it in Malaysia, be it in the United States, be it anywhere, use this to feed a domestic constituency. And often we see that both in Malaysia and in the context of the United States. So this particular thing is, how do you find a dynamic that is not reactive? How do you find a dynamic where you can build strong relationships? What is the most challenging part now is that the bilateral relationship is going to be massively impacted by the loss of capacity and the changes that are taking place within the US government. The cutting of State Department by almost a half, the processes that are ongoing, the changes into the Defense Department, the relationship, the working relationship has a potential negative consequences. What do you do in those circumstances? You have to continue the diversification strategy, but you have to be a bit more calculating and a little bit less provocative in how you do it. Sometimes, and this is where Indonesia offers some interesting lessons, Singapore offers some interesting lessons in how you go about doing it. And there are other players, mentioned was before GCC, Brazil, Turkey, Indonesia, India. These are other players, part of the marketplace. Smaller ASEAN relationships with a kind of mini bloc with Singapore. I think Singapore can be an extremely important ally now, especially to make an argument that if they support Singapore, they should support Malaysia because the tariff arrangements can be strong. And I know that this is part of the negotiating strategy. So there are other options here to do it. But I think there has to be, again, it's not about wanting to be in front. It's wanting to be smart in how you're seen in front.
Can I just add on to that on BRICS? I think there's been many comments made about BRICS, but to me, the strategic imperative of us being in the BRICS discussion has that case has not been a strong one. We saw that when Prime Minister Anwar first announced our intention to want to join BRICS, it was sometime in the middle of last year before Premier Lee Chiang's visit to Malaysia. I was made to understand that MITI and other government agencies were left scrambling to try to find reasons for why Malaysia should join BRICS. And when the narrative came out, BRICS represents a certain percentage of global GDP, it represents a certain percentage of global trade. All those facts are correct, but BRICS is not a free trade agreement. Right, so when Prime Minister Anwar makes the extra effort to go to Russia twice and going to Brazil a couple of times, we don't really see that kind of very strong narrative. And I think if that narrative is not strong, then we also need to recognize that that may be used against us, including by the United States with regards to our closeness to this particular association.
Yes. How will you respond to that, Bridget? Yeah.
No, I agree. There was one other point I had put in my notes, which I forgot to mention, which is that, not nowhere is stable. China, and if you engage with China, we don't know what's happening in that economy internally. Right? All right. There are always risks of everyone. Right. So the question now is to really have a diversified basket and not to put one versus the other, right, in these circumstances, and to recognize the risks. The China relationship with Malaysia has a lot of spillovers for SMEs. It's many of the markets are many companies are being pushed out of the marketplace. We have dumping that is taking place. So there are different dynamics that happen of this. This is why there is no neutrality.
Right. Yeah, I think even within the financial markets, we have also seen global central banks start to weaponize their reserve holdings, in response to some of these tactics by the US via the dumping of US treasuries, especially with the initial announcement of the tariffs. I mean, given the direction of where we're going, I hope I could get some insights from Fra regarding your thoughts on this weaponization of US Treasury holdings by central banks. We've actually seen the tit for tat developing between the US and some of the other G3 central banks. And do you think that is a cause for concern or perhaps delight of the increasing risks of the dollarization? Yeah.
Weaponization is a strong word, Ray. I wouldn't call it that. But having said that, I spoke about earlier in terms of how in a highly interconnected world, trade will find a way to adjust itself, given time. And I'm pretty confident that, we will have, global trade will come down a bit, but then it'll settle somewhat in a much perhaps acceptable position. But when it comes to global finance, when it comes to holdings of dollars and things like that, it's a little bit trickier because there is no credible alternative at this point in time, right? It's not a situation where you have something else. You talk about US dollar as the reserve currency. Yes, the position has come down a bit compared to before. But if you were to go to a number two, that number two is pretty far off. Is it euro? No. Markets are still fragmented. China can't be, given the capital controls. Gold, certainly not. There's lack of liquidity. Cryptos, heaven forbid. So on this journey of finding an alternative asset class or diversification, the trip's going to be quite bumpy in that respect. So what do central banks do? Because we have a mandate to protect the economy. So there'll be some very clever diversification on every central banks around the world, but it's not a situation where you're dumping the dollar, certainly not. For Malaysia, for example, we don't have a de-dollarization policy per se. we have a diversification policy. And I believe that remains the case for many central banks. Having said that, it is important then for us to secure the safety nets prevailing around the world, including the reforms of the IMF, including, for example, in the region, we talk about the strengthening of the Chiang Mai Initiative framework for regional currency networks. We speak about, these form of safety nets are critical. One absolutely important safety net is, of course, the US swap lines. And under this administration, US administration, is creating a lot of concern whether US will provide a similar safety line to countries during times of stress. Even the Europeans are talking about that. So with that being in suspect, everybody's for themselves, which is a very suboptimal conclusion. Hence the importance of the reform of these global safety nets that I spoke about. It has taken a certain urgency for many countries to pursue it on that route, apart from, every man for themselves. I'll pause there.
Right. Thank you very much for the insights, Fra. So I think it appears that I just want to follow on from what you said about everyone for themselves, and I mean it was quite evident, at least from my viewpoint, that essentially the US was initially heavily engaged at the front of the NATO front lines, and then after a while it started to kind of like withdraw from the geopolitical situation. Now it's in again, and it's actually got NATO to actually spend a lot more in terms of its defense infrastructure. So perhaps I'd like to get some insights from Kian Ming on this matter. I mean, what do you think is the US endgame with regards of exercising its muscle on the geopolitical front? Or do you think it's just going to be another distraction that's going to lead to nowhere? Or do you think Trump just sees this as another business deal?
I think we probably have to differentiate between the short-term priorities of President Trump as U.S. policy, since he is the U.S. president, and he, I think, has influenced a lot of the policy discussions and debates moving forward, and also the long-term trajectory of what the United States wants from countries in Europe. I think that the push towards NATO countries spending close to 5% of their GDP on defense is one that will take some time, but the momentum has started already. And if you listen to the former Dutch Prime Minister Mark Rutte, who is now the Secretary General of NATO, he is using this opportunity to play up to Trump's narrative that the Europeans have been sort of like free riding on US defense spending. So whether or not you can reach it in 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, that still remains to be seen. I think Spain has probably the only country in NATO that has come up to say that we may not be able to achieve that, but other countries are more or less on board. So I think from a long-term pivoting standpoint, it's something that is necessary for Europe. More importantly to us would be if, let's say, the US decides to somehow take away some sort of the security blanket that it has given to Asia Pacific. To what extent does it pressure countries in Southeast Asia, to increase their defense spending? We already see that happening in Japan. I think the Philippines is asking for help in this area as well. And of course, the threat there would be, what happens with a more military engaged China in the region. So that, I think, if let's say that happens in the region, then there will be knock-on effects, not just on the security front, but on the economic front, because we will have to balance between our other domestic and social objectives, and also the defense imperative. I think Europe probably has no choice now, but I think in the region, we still have a little bit more time and wiggle room.
Thank you, Kian Ming. How would you respond to that, Bridget? And do you think that the exercise of geopolitical tensions as a potential bargaining tool by the U.S. Is going to be an effective strategy, first of all? And I think, secondly, with the recent Israel-Iran ceasefire, do you see this as a real genuine step towards de-escalation, or is it something that economists and analysts in this room will have to factor into their fiscal expenditure forecasts as potential sovereign government credit risk that we have to take into account, given the intensifying geopolitical conflicts that we have actually seen in the region?
Let me answer the first part of your question first about building on what is happening in Southeast Asia. The geopolitics have shifted. Almost all of the countries have had a realignment towards China in some form. The question will become what the red lines are vis-a-vis China in terms of particularly the security areas. And China's influence has expanded in multifaceted ways beyond the economic. I think we can look at it in the transnational crime sector, into the security. I mean, and I think my caution to most Southeast Asian countries is to be more cautious of what China is doing and to look more carefully at it. I mean, I think obviously the attention is on what the U.S. is and this damage that it's causing, but I think one also needs to look more carefully at China and its regional role, particularly, as I mentioned earlier, on economic sectors, on the domestic economy, because I worry tremendously. In Malaysia, this SME sector the strategies and the policies are killing them softly, and they're hurting in that circumstances. The defense sector will be one that may come fast and furious over the issue of South China Sea. And we can see that the Defense Department received a massive influx of money in the ugly bill that the Trump administration passed. So therefore, there may be a bit of time, but when it does come. And so this, for a country like Malaysia, her defense spending is basically driven by patronage and corruption, and not necessarily a strategic sense of how to manage her defense. I think this is something that needs to be thought more carefully. And the white paper that the previous government has some good ideas and some good models, but I think, again, it's about thinking of these things holistically. In terms of the global geopolitics, let us not unfool ourselves of what is happening. They are destroying Gaza, and it is an abomination of what is happening. The Israel-Iran dynamic is not going to go away. It may be on hold, but it's something that's going to continue. The Ukraine war is also going to continue. And my own view is that the Trump administration may find additional things to do in order to continue to have a distracting strategy, be it Greenland or anything else in this process. This is the way that they are going about it. And I think that this points to a picture of greater instability and uncertainty and shocks in the system that people have to respond to. And as Fra was mentioning earlier, the biggest challenge is that the institutionals and the organizational frameworks to manage those shocks are also under challenge, and those things need to be buttressed.
Thank you. So indeed, we are going to see a continued transference of geopolitical risks to fiscal risk premiums. So I think the next question is whether that will eventually translate to liquidity risk premiums in the markets globally as well as in Malaysia. So I think on that note, perhaps Fra, maybe you could enlighten us on what are the potential trigger points before there are further policy responses by Bank Negara to deal with these transfers of geopolitical risks to fiscal risk and potentially to the monetary sector of the country?
Certainly, if you paint that picture, there is a need for us to be cautious. There is a need for us to be in a state of readiness to, make sure that we have some policy plans, policy toolkit in order to deal with a lot of these potential shocks. Uh, but having said that, I don't think we need to do at this moment in time to do additional efforts to do this. Why do I say that? There are inherent, for example, stabilizing forces in our markets, for example. We spoke about the influence of external forces into our markets, but we have a fair deal of institutional players that provide a stabilizing force in the market, which is why our yields have always been relatively well behaved. This is something that Malaysia enjoys, which are not always present in other countries. Um, Having said that, again, as a part of my policy toolkit, I must be in a state of readiness to make sure that the kit in my tools in my toolbox can be readily deployed, and I need to have a game plan together with Putrajaya, for example, on how do we tango between monetary policy and fiscal policy to provide us with that space. Now, encapsulating all this is, all these policy reforms that we spoke about. Mind you, I've always said Malaysia is a prolific reformer. We can't be where we are without the reforms that we've done in the past. However, in the last few years, we've been a little bit too distracted by politics, I would say, such that we can't embark all those things in a more timely manner, which is why the current momentum in terms of the reforms that we're trying to do, from water, electricity, chicken prices, diesel, whatever, that sort of thing, there needs to be a clear momentum for it to just pick up, while these shocks are still happening. Because the more you delay, the more you're limiting your room to maneuver in the future. You can have fantastic toolkits, but you may not be able to execute them if the macro environment is not there. So you need to do that. I know it's getting harder to do that reforms because that window is closing, but it is still there. When the economy is still growing, inflation is relatively well behaved, it's time to do that, to make sure that we have the necessary buffers when the time really comes for us to do all that. I'll pause here.
Wait, can I also ask Fra, maybe to highlight some of the things that the government is doing on the National Geoeconomic Task Force and then now the ASEAN Geoeconomic Task Force with regards to dealing with the supply chains? I know it's relatively early in the game, but since you're involved in that process, I know Liu Chintong, the Deputy Minister of MITI, is one of the people pushing for this. You want to maybe say a bit about that?
At the end from the audience instead of from Kian Ming. But Bridget, you spoke about China. It's very true, right? We are talking a lot about US, right? But US have said, look, you can't negotiate as a bloc. So each country has to come in unilaterally, bilaterally, and negotiate with US. That is what is demanded by our population and to some extent our political mandate. But having said that, the gorilla in the room is actually China. Whether we like it or not, China is the closest with the largest excess capacity. And where will those excess capacity go if they can't go to US? The clearest market is ASEAN. Hence, the challenge on our SMEs, our larger corporations, and things like that. But we can't do it all alone, right? Again, it is suboptimal for us to do bilaterally with US and then bilaterally with China. The good thing with China is we have institutions like, for example, RCEP, right? It's not perfect, but it's a platform where countries around the region can get together and deal with China, for example, right? So that momentum, where should that momentum start? Because RCEP could be seen as a China play, particularly by the US. The US said, BRICS, we don't like you, 10%. Going for an RCEP summit, they might say, hey, there's an RCEP summit, we don't like you, 10%. That has been their game. So how do ASEAN, as a group, for example, tackle this, tackling China, for example? When I say ASEAN, of course, ASEAN is not an economic bloc a la Europe. It's almost like typically in the past a coalition of the willing, of a few countries getting together and driving a certain agenda for the benefit of the entire region. It's not always perfect, but it's a good starting point. We have failed quite miserably, I would say, as a group, in order for us to do better as an economic, as an integrated economic unit. We've tried many things in the past; it did not always work. Suddenly, you have a great opportunity, a great pressure from both US and China. If we fail as a bloc, that's quite dismal, isn't it? So already I'm seeing that happening at the ASEAN meetings. Countries like Singapore are very enthusiastic now to drive some of this agenda. Things, smaller things, but very effective things. Things, for example, like linking up the regional payment system is more effective at this point in time in our long history of efforts towards integration in driving organic growth within the region. And hopefully more of that will come.
Thank you so much, Fra. You have worked very hard with that over time. With that, we will have to move to the Q&A, and I'd like to call upon our MC, Shamini, to help pass the mic around if there are any questions.
Hi, I'll get the ball rolling. I am Bazli from Pemuda National Berhad. So we talked earlier about the dollarization and whatnot. How there's no good alternative, right? But with the passage of the One Big Beautiful US fiscal deficit is expected to expand above 6% this year, 7% next year, and deteriorate even further. Considering this sort of thing, right, and considering this is a rating also event, how should we think about this? At some point, at what point is US debt no longer safe and its own ramifications for, well, the global financial system? Because, like, for Malaysia, if you're an emerging market, even a deficit above 3%, that's a bit high. But it's a bit of a double standard when it comes to, say, a country like US.
Hi, perhaps Fry, would you like to take that question since it relates to economics and perhaps take Basli's concern with regards to potential fiscal risk and whether there is even room for us to expand our deficit to GDP ratio above 3% persistently?
No. US is US, right? It has certain characteristics that others don't have. And it will continue to have that exceptionalism. I don't like to use that term because there's a lot of things behind it. But having said that, this talk about US dollar demise has been around for quite a while. And I think it's a little bit exaggerated at this point in time. I don't claim I know how that dethroning of the US dollar will come. If you look at all the past episodes of how global international monetary system went through a big shift, there was never a discrete moment. I'm not an economic historian, but from what I know, it always takes quite a bit of time for that to happen. So we could be, when you talk about all those figures, debt to GDP ratio at crazy levels, fiscal situation and everything. Certainly, US dollar looks in a very bad shape. US economy and certainly US dollar perhaps don't deserve to be where they are. But again, what's the alternative? I'm continually puzzled to some extent in terms of how that shifts are going to come in a orderly manner, right? But in the meantime, instead of settling down, you're going to have a lot of volatility amongst the asset classes, right? So I don't have a magic ball or I don't have an advice for you as a trader on how do you trade that, but certainly there's a greater caution when you want to undertake some of these investments. There's no running away from that.
Maybe I just want to add something on the domestic fiscal deficit, just to latch on to what Fra talked about with regards to this being a good time to continue the momentum for fiscal reform. I think the possibility of imposing a very elaborate targeted petrol subsidy by the end of the year, I think is the window is closing fast. I think even among the decision makers in MOF, I don't really see clarity in terms of what definition or what threshold they will use for T20, T15, T5, as well as even the mechanism. So my best hope is that by the end of the year, there can be a mechanism that is rolled out whereby, like what the second finance minister has said publicly, we are at least able to use the My Card for some sort of a verification or authentication to separate out between those who are Malaysians and non-Malaysians to be eligible for the fuel subsidy. And I think with that, there may be other things that can be done in a more substantive way next year. Because if you think about the timing, the RMK 13 is going to be debated at the end of July. We have the budget debate, and then we have the ASEAN summit. Not that many opportunities in between to roll out something that's very complicated and significant, but something is better than nothing.
Just a different take on that question. I think one has to understand that the US is in crisis. The polarization in the American society is very intense. The resistance to the Trump administration is on the streets every weekend. It is, to say that I call it a cold civil war that is taking place in American society. And I think that this is something that is probably not fully appreciated because the news headlines are dominated by Trump and not the other things that are happening in the US. But if you follow, it's really quite a profound shift. But the saying, where there's crisis, there is opportunity, is a very important thing to keep in mind. Strategic engagement in investment opportunities in the US, I think, are actually open now more than they have ever been because of things that have changed. So it is a need to be recognized. It is a large economy and there can be points for engagement. But it has to be done not with caution, but with strategy. And that's from a perspective of the country vis-a-vis the tariff negotiations, and also from businesses in terms of certain aspects of markets and areas, because of the fluidity that is happening there. There is opportunity.
Any more questions from the floor? None?
I have an email question from Datin Hanifa of Franklin Templeton. So perhaps I could get both Kian Ming and Bridget to respond. I will get Kian Ming to respond first. Basically, this is the question. Could a hardline US tariff stance toward Southeast Asian nations inadvertently strengthen China's strategic or economic position in the region?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Datin. I think very good way for me to promote a recent foreign affairs article that is written by two friends, professorial friends of mine, called "Southeast Asia is Starting to Choose," and this is, subtitle is "Why the Region is Leaning Towards China," written by Professor Kong Yuan Fong and also Professor Joseph Liao. One is at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, the other one is Joseph is at RSI at NTU. And they basically came out with a list of indicators with regards to trade, investment, and other ties that shows that even if, let's say, countries in Southeast Asia are saying that we want to maintain the balance between the US and China, by the structural, indicators that each country is, having, with regards to their dealings with China and US, they are already shifting. You look at long-term FDI trends, you look at, tourism trends, you look at the kind of engagements that different governments are having with China vis-a-vis the US. I think all indicators point towards us, being shifting and being more familiar with a much more stable ecosystem in China. That has good points and bad points, some of which has been covered already. But I think from a strategic standpoint, we need to know how Malaysia can benefit the most from our continued engagement with China. For example, the ECRL is going to start operating in 2026. What are the kind of investments that we want to bring in order to populate some of the industrial parks that are going to be alongside the key stations? How does this help the development of states like Kelantan, Terengganu, and Pahang? How will it increase the logistical connectivity between Kuantan and also Port Klang? Right, so all these things are things that I think are important opportunities and things that we should try to think from a more strategic perspective on how Malaysia can benefit and also limit some of the downside risks.
Would you like to add to that, Bridget?
This is a good article. I would recommend people read it. My own view is that most of Southeast Asia is already chosen. They aren't they've chosen, and many are making choices. So, but we could look at countries who have chosen and what the consequences have been. Look at what's happening to Brunei and to Thailand, who have made a very geostrategic positioning that haven't had an effective hedging and balancing strategies. So the need to have hedging and balancing is very critical. And I think Malaysia, while she's leaning, I think she's more and is more choosing China and is being pushed by the Americans in a bully way. The fact of the matter is that it has to be, as Ming said, strategic in what you want from China and conscious of what the negative consequences are. Right now, one of the most important things for Malaysia is to be able to maintain political stability and to include and continue the reforms, has been mentioned. I would emphasize that the reforms cannot just be economic policy. They have to be in areas of governance in order to be sustainable. And it has to recognize some of the fundamental imbalances that exist within Malaysia from a perspective of strengthening the domestic economy, engaging the drivers of instability, so policies that are more geared towards youth, towards moving away from urban centers to more regional growth across Malaysia. So again, thinking about these things strategically, thinking about how China's relationship with Malaysia, how US-Malaysia's relationship with Malaysia can actually help with those particular parameters, I think is quite important. Instead, what we see often, all too often, is wanting to make headlines as opposed to trying to get more substance on the reform initiatives. And that is the big challenge. There has to be prioritization. You have to, everybody, Mahathir was 100 yesterday, but on the 9th was the halfway point of Anwar's administration, at maximum. He is now on the second half. So it's reaching an inflection point. The window is very limited. We're looking at 6 to 8 months, and then elections are starting in Sabah already. So it's going to be a pivotal window, a very short period of time to do some key deliverables.
Right. Thank you, Bridget. So we have time for one last question from the audience. Okay. If there's no other question, I'd like to pass it back to our MC.